Okay, well, thank you both for being here. This is Willamette Week's endorsement interview for Oregon's 5th Congressional District, Democratic primary. We're going to start by asking each of you to take a couple minutes to tell us a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, your work experience, your civic involvement, and why you're running for office. So Representative, we'll start with you.
Sure. I'm Janelle Bynum. I proudly serve House District 39, currently in the state legislature. I was born in Washington, D.C., daughter of 2 teachers, and a proud graduate of a girls' boarding school because as I was growing up, Washington, D.C. became terribly dangerous. And having gone through public school most of those years, I was walking to school every day, and the streets just became a lot harder to navigate. So my parents pulled together what they could and sent me out to school, and that launched me into a career of leadership. So I was the head of boarding at the school, at the Madeira School, and eventually just went off to Florida A&M, a historically black college in Tallahassee, Florida, and majored in electrical engineering. And my first job out of college was at General Motors at Delphi Saginaw Steering Systems in Saginaw, Michigan, where I did product engineering and supplier quality engineering and worked all over the world. So in the Maquias along the border of Texas and Mexico, as well as France, Taiwan, and Luxembourg, and Alma, New York. So I was an international supplier quality engineer.
How long were you at GM?
6 years. So on September 11th, I was stuck in Taiwan, and that was kind of a transitional moment for our family. Having been stuck there for a week when I got back, we decided that international travel was kind of done for me at that time. I was pregnant with our first child, so that was really a transition. And so we decided that we would move back home. So it would either be my husband's hometown or my hometown. DC was really expensive, so we chose Portland. And he came here. We expected that my husband would work in the family business and I would go into the semiconductor industry or the electronics industry.
What was the family business?
It's McDonald's.
Got it, okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
So his mom was the first McDonald's operator, black McDonald's operator. So, fast forward now 20 years, I am the state representative. I first ran because I really cared about our education system and what our kids were, in North Clackamas, which is where we have our home, what our kids were experiencing in terms of the number of days of school that they were in and out, and that was really problematic for me. And it was also problematic for me the way I was seeing our kids show up in our restaurants to work. I didn't feel they had enough grit and the skills that they needed to show up every day and deliver, the customer service and the products that we were attempting to sell. So I ended up in the legislature after a really tough run for House District 51 against Lori, and I beat her. And
what year was that?
That was 2016. And then I won again in 2018 against her and have continued serving ever since.
So real quick, the 20 years between when you moved to Portland and then when you got into the legislature, what did you do in that interim? Or is the 20 years
it wasn't
the past?
Yet.
Okay. So what'd you do in that interim?
Right. So I became a McDonald's owner-operator, so we have to go through the whole idea of Hamburger University. That's a real thing. So I had to train. I've done every job in the store. Do I do them well? Not. My best job is as the person that hands out the drinks and takes people's change and helps people get what they need.
And how many McDonald's franchises do you guys own?
We have 4.
4. Okay. And real quickly, why are you running for office again?
I am the leader with a proven record of results. I have served honorably for 8 years, have passed some of the biggest legislation in this state, whether it's on the civil rights space, public safety, the Oregon CHIPS Act, Reproductive Health Equity Act. Some of the biggest pieces of legislation that Oregonians care about, I've been at the forefront of that. I am supported by grassroots people, as well as the highest leaders in the state, as well as people nationally. And no one else has the record that I have, and no one else has the level of support that I have.
All right, Jamie, go ahead.
Born in the Midwest. When I was, my mom was a single mom with 2 kids. She's worked 3 jobs, pretty much hand to mouth, but she's an educator. When I was 9, she took a teaching job in Tanzania, so I lived in East Africa for a period of time. Went to a government school where she taught. A lot of my classmates were refugees. It was during the time Idi Amin, who was in Uganda, when he invaded Tanzania. Actually, she sent me off to boarding school for a couple of years in Kenya, just while the war was going on. And then we returned to the States, moved to Southern Oregon, graduated from Ashland High. My first year of college was actually at Lewis and Clark, and was focused on cultural anthropology, but ended up transferring and following in the guy who became my dad, and met him overseas, following his footsteps, so going to RPI, becoming an engineer, and then went on to Cornell for my master's in regional planning.
Did you work as an engineer?
Yeah, I did. So I began my public service over in Bosnia and Kosovo just after the war. Back then, I'd come out as a young adult, so I could not serve in the military back then. So I worked for the International Rescue Committee. So I was their reconstruction manager, and then I designed water and sanitation systems. So I was their water and sanitation engineer. When I wanted to come back to the States, they asked me to run their refugee resettlement office in the South Bay in San Jose. So I did that for a few years before going into the public sector, working as a city planner, working also in organizational development for the city of Sunnyvale.
Remind us where you were a city planner?
In Sunnyvale, the city of Sunnyvale.
Okay.
So they actually were famous for reinventing government. So they had using a business approach to organizational development. So I actually started out on their organizational effectiveness team and then worked as a city planner. During that time, I also was elected as a city council member, served as vice mayor in Santa Clara. Oops, you okay?
That's not good.
You should. You want to get a napkin?
You got 2 engineers.
Nigel, you take over.
Yeah,
I can't
they're
fix
frowned.
that. Yeah, we have Apple Care.
So you were electors in Santa Clara, right?
Yeah.
And was that a full-time job, or was that?
No, so I was working full time,
Yeah.
and then it was about 20 hours a week. I mean, some people would just kind of phone it in, but I do a lot of work. I served on a lot of committees. Santa Clara owned its own power utility. It was a full-service city. I also did a lot of work around on water and sanitation issues. During that time, my day job, then I got a job with the regional, it's the Santa Clara Valley Water District, so I was working there as an environmental planner, and that served the entire Silicon Valley essentially in terms of providing water to residents and businesses. And so those were concurrent during those 2 times. I think the longest week I had was probably about 100 hours, and I figured those weeks were long. And so worked there. When I termed out, I really wanted to come back.
After 2 terms?
After 2 terms, yeah. There was a 2-term limit there, so yeah. But yeah, I was served. There was a housing rehabilitation committee. I was actually talking to someone just last night who works for Clackamas on housing issues, and so yeah, we did affordable housing for teachers. A lot of the problems and challenges we're seeing now, we actually worked in a partnership with the school district. I was, involved in the power utility. Silicon Valley Power, it owns its own power utility. So when I got there, the city owned, or was part owner of a coal-fired plant. The first step was getting scrubbers. The next step was essentially divesting from that into natural gas, which was the transition fuel. And then also we started buying some electrons from the wind farms up in Oregon, actually. So then purchasing and renewable energy. And so we actually, under my leadership, we moved more aggressively. California had AB 32, these environmental goals. We exceeded those goals years ahead of the deadline, the state post deadline. I also served in a lot of, like I said, regional committees. I was the chair of the Recycling Waste Reduction Commission for the county, and led the effort to develop a single-use plastic bag ban, and that was that was something that then the state law ended up being based on. That was bringing in a coalition of folks. I actually laughed at the first BEEP episode had this thing about the plastics. It was the same guys that were part of that conversation. So housing built a partnership with developers needing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so, how can we take steps without incurring costs? Well, the number one emitter was transportation. Number two was construction. So I developed, co-founded the Green Building Coalition, bringing in developers and city staff and other council members. And the biggest headache that the developers had was the process. So all these cities together and all the different processes, and they just wanted to expedite their process. So we developed a program with them, a 3-tier program on renewable energy. It resulted in massive reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. It also allowed for the political diversity of those communities to opt into something that's right fit for them. So Palo Alto, which is like a Portland, versus Gilroy, which is more like a Redmond in terms of their policies.
So when did you come back to Oregon?
So after I termed out of office, I had been looking to come back. I was also thinking about going back to school, to law school. And so I actually applied. Took the LSATs that summer and was thinking about coming back the following year, but the U of O offered a nice little package. With the option, Lewis and Clark didn't have their reconsideration up till the next spring. And so it was literally a week or two out. And I actually took a leave of absence from work because I wasn't sure if I would enjoy law school, and so ended up going and really enjoying it, leaning into it, and focused on water law and Indian law. I was debating between going to law school focused on water law or looking at U of O for water policy. Natural resource policy is a big thing for me. But anyway, I met my wife, became a stepmom during that time, and then thought I would focus on water and natural resource policy. I do serve on the OWEB board, got appointed to that later, but ended up getting back into local government as a city manager.
Phoenix or Talent?
In Phoenix, yeah. And that was, I was recruited by, it was a city that was having a lot of issues. I was recruited by an outgoing mayor days after I started. The mayor who had been responsible for driving out the first female city manager was elected mayor. He also made international headlines a couple of years later, running his car into a participant at a Black Lives Matter rally. He was kind of a strong-willed character who wasn't happy with my politics, and so he got me fired.
One part of your biography that's always puzzled me is, so you did have this elected official experience in a very sophisticated part of the country, maybe the most sophisticated part of the country. You did a lot of big things there, and then you go to law school, and then you go to Phoenix. It seems like a big step backward, frankly, in terms of what you had done in California.
Well, one of the challenges I think we have here in Oregon in general, and that's especially in smaller and rural areas, is being able to have places. If you don't end up in Portland, there's not a lot you can be doing in different areas. And so what I've actually even just 2 nights ago was talking to some folks in Bend. We're trying to essentially build up incubator systems in Bend. But frankly, I wanted to come back to Oregon. Oregon has been home for me. My family stayed here.
But why not Portland, I guess? I mean, because you had operated on a pretty big stage in California.
I had, and that's been, so Oregon politics tends to be a very closed environment. And so the option was to move to Portland. With all due respect, I love visiting Portland. I'm happy in more rural areas, and there's the opportunities are very different in different areas.
Can you remind us what state offices you've run for?
I ran for Secretary of State here.
Okay.
But I had, when I was in California, I had a lot of people wanting me to run for state legislature there. I wanted to come back to Oregon. And to your point, I was essentially moving up that ladder, but California and Oregon are very different. And my family's here. I wanted to be back in Oregon.
And how many times total have you run for office in Oregon?
So for the ESD board where I served, Well, actually, no. In 2018, I ended up running for the Oregon's 5th, which is everything east of the Cascades in Southern Oregon. It's an R+18, R+19. It was essentially challenging Walden because he was going after healthcare. I had the largest voter swing in any congressional race in the country. So that was one. I won the primary in a 7-way and lost the general by the closest margin he's ever had. I ran for Secretary of State. I lost the primary, won 19 out of 36 counties in the rural areas. I talk a lot about the urban-rural divide because it's a real thing. And I ran against Kurt.
So that's 3, was it 3 times?
I'm sorry, in 2019, I ran, I was elected to the ESD board in Central Oregon. And it's been mocked, but it's also, we served during COVID and helped kids. It's one of the most diverse counties in the state. Jefferson County is about a third kids from Warm Springs, so tribal, indigenous, about a third Latino, and about a third Caucasian. Very rural areas, very hard hit. When I was actually at U of O, I took a leadership class from now the late Dave Frommeyer. And one of the things that he said, and he did the same, he went off to fancy schools and then came back to Oregon. And he said that's an important thing he thought to do. And he thought that was a thing of great value.
So along those lines, what is it about this office? What about service? I mean, you ran against Walden, now you're running for this seat. What is it about service in Congress that really appeals to you?
Well, it's something that there are issues I have a lot of experience with. I think the relationships I have. I went to grad school with Gabby Giffords. I built up a lot of relationships with folks around the country. I've served in an international capacity. In Silicon Valley, you rub shoulders with the elite businesses, the elite politicians in the world. The same as in place when I went through the Harvard executive ed program.
So you know a lot of people, but what do you actually want to do? If elected, what do you actually want to do in office?
Sure. Well, there are protecting fundamental democracy, our fundamental rights, the right to access to abortion, voting rights, the Equality Act, the PRO Act. These are all areas that are really key. Our democracy, making sure that we are building up our partnerships internationally, and also protecting our allies, being a good international partner, especially in this time of conflict and war. I think that the political divide, the urban-rural divide that we've seen, these are divides that I've been a part of my entire life. When I was working in Kosovo, you literally go into school and there was a brick wall up the middle with Kosovars on one side and Serbs in the other. And so running shuttle diplomacy, it's the work I've done also even in rural areas. Kitchen table issues. No, but you've asked me. The kitchen table issues of healthcare and housing, and I've done this stuff on the ground. And so, housing legislation is passed by the legislature with the majority of folks from the Portland area with policies that have been really good for Portland, and they've not been good for rural areas. I think there's a bias and a perception against folks from rural areas that why would you go live there? Because it's a great quality of life, because my family lives there, because I'm proud of living in rural areas. There's no shame in living in rural areas. And so being able to represent a rural area, I think, is a really valuable thing. The Farm Bill, people are hungry right now. There's also the Stafford Act. So when it's reauthorized, making sure that heat domes are covered as part of the reauthorization so FEMA can compensate for the impacts we've had here in Oregon. Dealing with the climate crisis.
Okay, great. Go ahead.
I was just going to ask, what would you say to a Democrat that says, okay, we want a Democrat in the 5th District, and Representative Bynum is, I think both of you would probably agree, a more moderate Democrat, and Representative Bynum probably has a better chance as a moderate Democrat of unseating Chavez DeRemer. What would you say to a Democrat who said, look, I just want a Democrat in office, so why would I endorse Jamie over Representative Bynum?
Absolutely. First of all, if this concept of moderate, I think you don't understand folks in the district. If it's not that simple, it's the issues that people care about. In the Santiam Pass, when they lost all those homes to wildfire, They're concerned about wildfire. That's not a moderate or Republican or Democrat issue. Housing, getting people and being able to be effective on the ground is really key. The Republicans in Central Oregon worry about drought. I was in communications just yesterday with someone who's an executive director of one of the irrigation districts who's struggling with drought, and I helped actually build up legislation that I'm getting passed by the legislature a couple years back. But the bottom line is to be able to win the district in Deschutes, which used to be part of the old 2nd, is now over a quarter of the voters in the 5th. I have outperformed every Democrat running for president since 1964. I'm able to...
And that's 25% of the voters in D5.
Yeah, so when Janelle mentioned the first time she ran against and beat Lori was in 2016. She lost in Clackamas County. I beat Lori in Clackamas County. She won in Portland. That was a House district, about a 10th the size of a congressional district. It was in the Portland metro area where no Republicans are elected. This district is not, the majority of the district is outside the metro area.
So you think that the fact that Representative Bynum has beaten Chavez Dreamer twice is not indicative of her chances this time? Not
at all, because it doesn't, there's, was it 5% overlap with the district? I mean, there's a vote. One of the things that we provided with some data is that even just the overlap with the district is minor. I believe folks send this to you, but if you look at, even in Multnomah County, it's only 7% of the voters. Head-to-head against Lori, Janelle got 58%. I got 80%. So even in those areas.
Do you want to respond to this kind of, because I think I've seen this graphic too. I didn't really know what to make of it. Representative Bynum, do you think it's indicative that you've beat Chavez Dreamer twice?
Yeah, I do. I think because you understand how the other candidate works. I warmed up the electorate so that other people could win Clackamas County. Right around the time that I was running, it was very red and it was a hard place to win. But what I did was try to make sure that the issues of whether it was Multnomah County or whether it was East Portland or Damascus or Boring, I knocked those doors. And people hadn't been talked to in years. I knocked doors in Milwaukee. People hadn't been talked to in years directly. And so I think that is the difference in terms of how you run an election, how you run your candidacy, and you draw a very strong distinction between yourself and the other candidate. What's really interesting is in the 15 precincts, I think, where CD5 overlaps with House District 39, I had a 4% edge over Jamie. So there were votes left on the table, and perhaps, I haven't done the math, but perhaps those votes are ones that could have gotten us over the edge and we could have won the seat.
Can I just clarify? So on some of those are partial overlaps, so she's counting areas that I wasn't even on the ballot in terms of that.
No, it was the full overlap.
So there's that piece. If you look at the 2022 cycle, Oregon faced a similar dynamic as New York, lost five Democrats lost their seat, including the chair of the DCCC. I overperformed the governor by 7 points in the district. Last cycle, both county commissioners lost, including a sitting county commissioner, a moderate county commissioner in Clackamas County. And so last year was a challenging cycle. Lori also didn't have a voting record, which is going to be very different in this cycle. It's going to be a different dynamic overall, but having a base throughout the district is really, really key. With the exception of Milwaukee, the cities that my colleague referenced are not even in the 5th congressional district. So having the two purple areas, Clackamas and Deschutes, which make up 2/3 of the district, I won both those counties. I beat Lori there.
Okay, can we move away from the numbers and ask you to tell us something difficult that you've accomplished that actually is difficult? That is reflective of why you would be a good congressperson. Well, same question for both of you. Why don't you go first?
Yes, sure. I think the 23 or so police accountability and civil rights bills that I passed during George Floyd is an indicator of how I was able to thread a very difficult needle. So, we had protests going on downtown. We had people who were very critical of what was happening. Maybe without completely understanding what the pain the city was going through. but also very concerned about the destruction of downtown. So the question for me was, as a leader, how do I make sure that I hear people's pain, I respond to the pain, but we also have guidelines and boundaries in our community so that we don't destroy things. And so in the legislature, the decision that I made was, number one, to make sure that we came together with the BIPOC caucus and tried to understand, okay, what legislation do we think needs to be changed, and how can we lead on that in a productive way? The other thing is, with my rural colleagues who weren't experiencing it but just were seeing it on television and trying to interpret the way that they knew how to interpret, how could I lead them to make some fundamental changes in policing that we know we needed? So we changed chokeholds. You can't do a chokehold anymore. We took the advice of one of the mayors of the city of, I think, Tigard, and he's an EMT, and he proposed that we changed the way we trained police on turning people over and making sure their airways weren't restricted. We also, I think, without going through a laundry list, the most important thing was I looked at Ron Noble as my partner. I was, of course, in the power position as the chair.
Noble being the Republican former police chief in McMinnville.
Absolutely. And so my assumption was that there were things about policing that I didn't know or understand. And rather than just looking at him as the Republican, the minority, I looked at him as my equal partner. And I also took the position that the people in the streets had a grievance, and the way to calm that down was to address the grievances.
So can I ask you, with all due respect, that was a different time, and Democrats did have a strong majority in both chambers, so how hard was it really to pass that legislation?
It would have been easy to pass anything that I wanted, but that wasn't the point. Passing what I could have passed wasn't the point. The point was to pass good legislation that the whole legislature could generally agree on. That, to me, is the difference. You can do whatever you want, but are you going to assign any quality to it?
Did you have Republican votes for most of those bills? I can't remember.
I did. Yeah. Because Ron Noble was able to help lead, and Christine Drazen, I made sure that they were in on everything. Anything that we proposed, they had red line authority for.
Okay.
And I don't know that any Democrat would have done that. I could have done anything, but I chose to work on behalf of the entire state, not just people.
Same question for you, Jane.
Yeah, and I'll go with the same thing on equity issues, but I think your point is a really salient one. If you're in the majority, that's not a challenge. In the 12 years I've served in elected office, I've always been in the political minority, and so you have to learn how to actually work with your colleagues to get things done. Going back to actually in Santa Clara when the 49er Stadium came in, that's a whole other project working on, but there was a lot of stands on political courage that was required. But let's focus on Oregon, on the Jefferson County ESD where I served. Jefferson County is a very conservative county. I think it was the fourth to join the Join Idaho movement. It's a conservative county. Was elected to that ESD and selected as chair. I'm really proud of my colleagues consistently in roles I've had of selecting me to lead them. And what I did then was brought forward a racial justice and equity policy. Not something, well, at that time is when Newburgh was blowing up, when even here in Portland it was a struggle to move forward on developing that policy for school districts and ESDs. And I got my colleagues to we unanimously passed it. Now, part of that was a lot of work that went into it, a lot of staying away from buzzwords and talking to my colleagues about the issues of how we keep communities safe, getting that to be the focus so that we could have a bipartisan support for that. Part of it also is telling personal stories. I mean, being an out lesbian, I'm actually the first out lesbian elected east of the Cascades in Oregon, and being out in rural areas, you are vulnerable. You're physically sometimes in danger, but you're vulnerable to be able to help people come to that place is to tell your own story. But also procedurally, there was, it's a longer story, but I was able to bring it up at a key time, and we were able to move that forward. So being able to get move forward on a policy that was essentially blown up statewide in a place where I was a political minority, I think is more telling.
What exactly was the policy? What was in it?
It was developed statewide. I was part of that board as well. It was like the ESD had I can't read it. I can send it to you, but I can't give you word for word on it. But it was a statewide policy. It was developed as a proposed policy, and we adopted the proposed policy in total. So it was something that folks from Portland to Ontario to Medford were working on to develop and craft something. But this is the same policy that other areas just outside the Portland area could not move forward.
If we could shift a little bit to endorsements, why do you think you lost the Emily's List endorsement? I've seen, if you look at their track record, I mean, they tend to focus more on urban areas. There's also we both have support at the national level. Janelle's got the Congressional Black Caucus, I've got the Equality Caucus. There is support that's come in from other folks at different levels. There's national organizations. It was a decision they made. I know there was there have been different dynamics that have played out, but they are an organization that has more typically focused on Democrats from urban areas, but you would ultimately have to ask them. And they'd endorsed you in 2022, correct?
Very late in the race, and not in the primary, okay. But very late in the general. Mm-hmm. They had actually, if I may, in 2018, when I ran, even when I was the nominee, they had initially said they stayed out of that race altogether, and they had initially said they would endorse if I raised $500,000. I raised $500,000. It was said, okay, we'll endorse if you raise $1 million. We raised $1 million. We actually raised 3 times as much as that had ever been raised in the entire total in that race by a Democrat, and they ended up staying out. So they've been, I think across the country, we've seen them not jump in as much to rural races, and I know they were also getting a lot of blowback from their own staff on endorsements.
And then Representative Clackamas County Black Democrats. I read the whole email thing. Can you just talk about why you didn't get that? Why do you believe you didn't get that endorsement? Do you think it really boiled down to them not seeing an email, or?
So they did eventually endorse when they got the information. Just to be clear, I think the message here is when you decide as an organization that you're going to run a process, you need to have structure, and I'm not sure that they had all the structure that they needed in place. So what they've changed to is like a common mailbox that multiple people can access. Right at that point, they had one person with the email. I saw the 4 emails or 3 or 4 emails that my campaign manager sent. And then I think, let's just be honest, because Oregon is such an open and welcoming state when it comes to any type of caucus, the Black Caucus has more than Black people in it. And I believe there's probably 2 Black people in this caucus.
Out of how many?
I can't even tell.
Jamie, you want to respond to that? No.
Wow. I think that's an interesting statement.
Well, help us out. Why is it interesting?
I'll just say that I am honored and appreciate the support I've got from folks throughout the district. I've got at the federal level, state level, but really within the district. Polling in the district, even independent polling, showed me up over 30 points consistently because of the base I've got in the district, and that's I've shown up both for diverse communities, including my own, my entire career, and I really appreciate I got their endorsement last cycle as well. And but I also will say that I don't follow up, and if someone's chose not to endorse, I respect that. I don't, and I made sure my team doesn't browbeat or bully anyone. it's their decision to make.
I want to ask you, we've reported and other media have reported on difficulties between you and former staff members. You've run a number of times, and everybody who runs has various interactions, but you've built something of a reputation as somebody who's difficult to work with. I'd like to ask you to address that.
Well, I think that your story, well, I'm not saying I think your story was false. It was a false accusation. I think we gave you enough information to show it was also very clearly driven by Janelle's team. This is a political strategy they've used going back to the summer.
I didn't have anything to do with that, so let me just be real
even in
clear.
DC. So Chris Baer, who is an advisor on her team, and then also we were hearing even in DC that her paid comms team, Pivot, was pushing the story going back to the summer. So I will say,
with all due respect,
that's false. That would fit on the record. That's false. That's a lie.
that they weren't pushing things in. I heard from multiple sources going back to the summer that they were pushing the story in DC. We've heard from other consultants, other organizations that are not even associated with me.
So regardless of where the story came from, there have been a number of people who have worked with you in paid positions, other people who have worked with you in an advisory basis who have raised concerns. Stipulated, there may be political consultants pushing that story for a variety of reasons. You and I know, and Janelle knows that happens. Everybody does that every cycle. I'd like you to address the substance of the accusation that you're a difficult person to work with.
Okay, that's separate from the story. Your story was false. I want to just be really clear on that.
We stand by our story. We want to be clear about that. But let's go to the substance of the.
So, I will say that I demand a lot of myself, and in the times that I've worked in challenging environments, when a lot is on the line, I work with teams where a lot's demanded of us in general. And this is true in Bosnia. It was true working with refugees. It was true working in wildfire recovery. In each of those cases, my team wanted me to stay on. In campaigns I've run, I've had staff who've worked with me consistently throughout multiple cycles. They're not working in the cycle because some of the key people have been hired away by U.S. Senate staff, and so they're working with other folks now. So to that point, there's also been plenty of people who've gone on the record who have challenged and given a very different account of what's been alleged. I will say campaigns are stressful, and for that, it's a tough environment. There's some people who really thrive in that environment, other people don't. I'll also say that in every situation I've been in, I work on, there's the plus delta cycles we go through, my teams go through, and it's looking at both what worked and how we can get better. I'm constantly looking for how I can get better as a leader. But I will also say, and you guys have been really focused on this, I've never been sued by my employees. Janelle has. And that includes for defamation. Those are standing lawsuits that are out there. There are stories of her staff that have bubbled up and have raised these exact concerns. We have not cultivated a story.
I don't even know that guy.
We'll finish up in this second. So, are you saying that you haven't done anything wrong? Is that there's nothing in the way that you've dealt with campaign staff or others in your previous campaigns that you regret or would do differently?
I will say that we have always focused on doing a hard job to the best we can, the best of our ability, and that is as a full team. There's some folks also, someone who's attributed who claimed to be part of the team who was not part of our team. There was someone else who has been a part of my team in the past who said someone reached out to her and was claiming to have worked with me who I've never even heard of. And so some of the claims and accusations are coming from people that I've never worked with. But in terms of work I've done in the past, I mean, there's always opportunities looking back to say, hey, could we have done that better? And that's why I mentioned the plus delta. We go through that on a consistent basis with our teams. And it's something that it's both for how we do things as a team, but also for myself. So I'm always looking for opportunities to be a better leader. This is something I've done consistently throughout my career. But at the same time, we've had folks who have shared their stories. That's not newsworthy, apparently, of folks who've shared their stories and talked about how they've thrived under my leadership, how they really appreciated the work that we've done. There are some folks who were essentially came in and they were forced to be part of the team that also created conflict within the team. There's been times and there's been conflict between the teams that frankly, looking back, I should have asked someone else to handle and deal with, but it was stepping between two people where they were breaking up the team. The transition from the primary to the general last cycle was difficult, going from essentially running against the DCCC to working with them, and having people literally screaming on the phone and doing really negative things to folks who worked with in my primary. And so I was trying to protect those folks. But I've got in places I've worked before, I've got folks who talk about how I've actually stepped in and protected them, and then I've sometimes been attacked for it.
How many employees worked on your 2022 campaign?
With employees versus consultants.
Let's do both.
In the primary, I have to go through the numbers because there's consultants that
just maybe rough number. I mean, 5 to 10, 10 to 15, 15 to 20.
Well, the structures that we set up, we also have a lot of volunteers. So we typically have people who, like consultants, we might...
Sure, not volunteers.
But we have folks in our campaigns who are super volunteers. I've got a guy who I work with who he volunteers to do it, and he's independently wealthy. He can
So
do it.
and why I'm asking is because we talked to 4 people who worked on your 2022 campaign for the story that we wrote, and they all corroborated everything that we heard of. They provided contemporaneous text messages, notes. I mean, why would 4 people who went to work for you, and some who it appeared went to work for you because they had a lot of respect for you prior to that, why would they lie about this?
I've had people who came in, and I assume you're talking about are you talking about the primary or the general? Because there's some very different people who came in.
Primary.
In the primary, 2 people worked for me. It was actually 2, it was 1.5 in the primary.
My story was in the spring, right? That was the time frame?
In the primary 2020 cycle, there's one person who worked full-time who now works for Senator Biden, and one person who worked part-time who now works for
So
Senator
whatever time frame my story was, and I don't recall if it was the primary or the general, I should know that. But, we talked to 4 people who worked on your campaign who corroborated these allegations and provided notes, provided text messages. Again, why would 4 people that went to work for you, and a couple of them because it was you, because they really wanted to work on your campaign, why would they lie about this kind of thing?
Your story was about an allegation that is not true. That was the focus of your story. And that's different if folks...
January 2024.
Thanks.
Was the story.
Thanks.
Okay.
Or sorry, but what was it? Anyway, sorry, go on.
That's when
the story, but... So
I'm just trying to figure out if the time frame was the primary or the general. Maybe it doesn't matter.
We're getting a little caught up really getting a story that we stand by.
Let's move on.
Yeah.
So.
But again, there's a case of we've got someone in this race who has, their employees have actually sued them. And that's not, I don't know.
Okay, so would you like to respond to that, Representative Bynum?
I don't know the guy. We have 250 employees, probably, I don't know, maybe 400 a year. Been in business since 2007. I have a very strong track record of treating my employees well, and people will differ on what they think you've said, but in this case, I don't know the guy, and so I'm sorry I can't offer anything more.
This was at McDonald's?
It's a defamation lawsuit over theft or money that didn't get deposited at the end of a month, I think. Yeah.
Just a bookkeeping thing. Do you live in the district now? Am I remembering this correctly?
No, we live a couple miles out. Crook River Branch is on a peninsula. The only way to get to and from it is from, yeah. There's also former campaign staff, again, that we've been told have already reached out to you guys. But that's your choice if something that you're going to pursue or not in terms of the complaints that are made about my opponent.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I want to ask each of you to ask your opponent a question. We often do this. You've been here before. The purpose of it is for you to draw a contrast, not for you to make a statement. So please phrase this in the form of a question that can actually be answered. It's up to you to how substantive or lacking in substance it is. Jane, we'll give you a chance to go first.
Sure. First I want to say I appreciate and respect a lot of your service in the legislature. But
Not all of it.
not all of it. Not all of it. We're going to get to that.
Okay.
We're going to get to that. And probably one of the most important issues that voters are going to be thinking about is about protection of our bodies and right to make reproductive health care decisions. And you were the lone legislator, Republican or Democrat, to vote against and give a floor speech against extending the statute of limitations for rape victims to 7 years. So it was 2 years right now in Oregon. The statute of limitation for someone who trespassed on your property is longer than the statute of limitations to protect if you have been raped. A lot of rape victims go through trauma, cannot speak to it right away, cannot address it. Trump and Jeffrey Epstein, we wouldn't even have lawsuits against these folks if there wasn't statute of limitations.
Is there a question coming?
You stood up. You not only voted against extending protection, statute of limitation for rape victims to 7 years. You gave up, and you stood on the floor and gave a floor speech, and it's I think OPB covered it, on protecting, essentially making an argument to protect rapists. Republicans voted unanimously for that.
Is there a
You
question
won.
coming?
So giving the context so that the question can be understood, why would you vote against extending the protection of rape victims, the statute of limitations, to 7 years?
So we had a discussion in our Judiciary Committee about what it means to ensure justice in our justice system. And what we were finding in that conversation was that there was a patchwork for victims. It wasn't the same for certain types of claims. And I don't have a very strong memory of everything that was discussed, but I do remember how I felt. And I felt that if you couldn't approach justice in a way that was very clear and understandable for everyone involved, and if, as I think that was the testimony, if the longer things went, the less likely it was for a victim to receive justice, then we were providing, as a legislature, false hope. And we were providing a situation where people could neither seek justice fairly nor could they defend themselves fairly. And you, as an attorney, should know that the system should work. Our goal should be that it works for everyone, and that it is practical and it is simple to address when there is a dispute between two people or two entities, or multiple entities for that matter. And so one of the techniques in the legislature is to cast a vote of no, not because you believe that there's something fundamentally wrong, or not because you believe that this policy shouldn't pass, but you signal that something is wrong. And everybody on that committee knew, I believe everybody on that committee knew that there was unfinished work that the legislature needed to do. And I wasn't willing to punt. And I wanted the Senate to have the conversation about what was wrong. And they did. I didn't I didn't engage in whatever the additional conversations were. I just knew that, and Jennifer Williamson, I think, was the chair of the committee at that time. I think she acknowledged in our deliberations that day that things were a little bit out of whack and we probably needed to tidy up some of our legislation. So that was simply it. So we passed it, and and my colleagues told me, like, Janelle, only you could have said what you said and forced us to clean up what was.
Do you still stand by that vote, or would you vote differently if that came up again?
I don't know what has changed since then. I know I'm probably a more sophisticated legislator now, and maybe there are other tools. I could have said, how about we not hear this on the floor until we make this change so that everybody can vote yes? And I don't know that at that time I had that level of sophistication as a legislator. But that certainly is something that can happen behind the scenes rather than forcing a person to take it to the floor.
How did this tidy it up? Or is that too...
That's too granular of a question for me to remember, and I'm sorry.
But that was your motivation, was?
There was unfinished work, and I had asked to be on the Judiciary Committee because I felt like civil rights and the way women and the way people who are minorities were receiving justice in this state was a challenge for me. And we see that whether it's black women and domestic violence, we die. Whether it's black men and their incarceration rates, they're much higher. And everybody that I would ask would say, I can ask, do you think black people are more dangerous? No. Well, then why are our numbers so high, right? One other good example right now is public defenders. We have not solved that problem of not having not having an adequate number of public defenders in our system. And that continues to be an open wound for me.
I don't want to push this. I just want to understand. So somehow having a shorter statute of limitations on rape tidied something up.
I think what it was. Well, I think what the argument was, and I'd have to go back and look at the whole thing, but I think what the argument was situation A was 5 years and situation B was 7 years or something like that.
All right, you wanted to harmonize them.
That's all I wanted. That's all I wanted. And what we were being told was that the longer it stretched out, the less likely it was for the person to receive justice. And if the problem were a serious problem, the DAs would have said no. Domestic violence would have said no. Women's advocacy would have said no. They all would have said no. There's no way the bill could have passed if they didn't agree to it. That's how the legislature works. The advocacy groups will tell you no. So somewhere in there, the Senate must have made some sort of agreement, and it was fine after that. That I didn't have anything to do with it.
Okay, let's move on. Can you ask your opponent a question, please?
What do you do to relax?
I spend time with my wife and our critters.
Fun question? Is that our last one?
Yeah, we're just about out of time.
Okay. We always end with a fun question.
Okay.
I don't know.
Because this has been hard.
If there were to be a movie made of your life, what actor or actress would play you?
Kerry Washington, but she would have to put on a couple of pounds.
It's noted to other people that physical resemblance is not necessary to the project.
Optional.
You can go with a case plan to play softball and things. Direction you want to go.
But I also think like as being a black woman, like part of your physical presence is like who you are, like this robust woman who can like fry fish and have an intellectual conversation and not play basketball. But Kerry Washington, she's like her own kind of icon, and she's thin and beautiful, and I'm full and beautiful.
All right, Kerry Washington, Jamie.
That's a great question. I'd have to. I've never thought about that before. Such a funny thing. It's also that, well, you talked about being anyone or anything, but it's there's also limits to the to what I could choose, because anything I would choose would be
There are no limits here with this question.
Well, but there are because whatever I choose can get reflected back. I mean, I get called to mannish in my photos on. I get criticized for being an out lesbian. I get criticized for, and so someone who came to mind was actually a prominent lesbian actress, who I think is really cool. But it's also part of that whole dance of
Maybe think about it this way. If no one were to see this movie, it was just for you, who would you want to play you?
The recent movie about the woman swimming across the...
Diana.
Yeah. Well, she's really cool, but actually Jodie Foster, I love her role in that. And Jodie Foster's done some really cool things, and I think she's been really badass. But also, yeah. I appreciate that it's considered a simple question, but at the same time, roles being reversed, you don't realize how many landmines there are out there for literally anything you say.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
All right.
Thank you both very much for coming in.
Thank you.
You see your photos.
Oh, yeah.